Let's go ahead and start, as I said, with just a short meditation. So I think probably most of you have some experience around meditation, but it is good first to just kind of check your posture, make sure the back is somewhat upright. Feet should be kind of planted on the ground if you're sitting in a chair. If you're on a cushion, just make your feet as comfortable as possible. And if you need to close your eyes, that's fine, but it's also helpful sometimes to leave a little bit of light coming in. Just bring the eyelids down to where there's just a crack of light so that you can keep the mind a bit more alert. So we're going to start with just doing a few minutes of meditation on the breath. So if you have a technique that you already use to meditate on the breath, you can do that. If you need a suggestion, you can tune into the sensation at the tip of the nose, around the nostrils, where you feel the air coming in and then going back out. Just make that your focal point and try to stay present with it as best as you can. And when you notice that the mind has wandered away from the breath, maybe you've gotten distracted by things that happened today or plans for later in the week, then just let that go and bring the mind gently back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime here to begin our meditation, and then I'll come in a few minutes and lead you in a short reflection so we can set our motivation for our time together. So this course we are calling The Science of Happiness. And I thought to set our motivation, we might first begin with just a short reflection on what we think happiness is. Maybe just spend a few minutes investigating your own thoughts about this. What is happiness? What is entailed in having happiness? What are the causes of that even? Just spend a few minutes in your own investigation. We'll have an opportunity to share later. But just let your mind kind of fill in the blank on that. What is happiness? How do we obtain that? What are the causes? And whatever our answers are to those questions, we can develop a motivation that wants some measure of happiness for ourselves, kind of starting there. We are all here to explore how to create the causes of happiness within our own experience, our own lives. And we also want to enlarge that motivation, to think that we're here to help other beings, certainly in our lives, those that we know and interact with. It'd be wonderful if we could also help them to have some form of happiness. And can we take it even beyond that? To think about all the beings in our community, city, town, in our state, in our country. Can we even take it out to having a motivation that wants to help all the beings in this world to have happiness? Sounds rather lofty, but this is how we create very positive results, is by thinking big, thinking in a vast way. Even to go beyond this world to wherever there are beings, whatever realms of existence there might be. We're going to try to be here tonight with all of them in mind, thinking that we're trying to create the causes for the well-being of all those who exist, wherever they are. And in this way, we have very vast results from these thoughts. And just kind of hold that awareness of being here for yourself and for the sake of all beings. And you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin the class. So I do know that there was a course held not too long ago here at Ocean of Compassion, run by my dear friend Tenzin Choki on cultivating emotional balance. Yes. And so there will be some similarities and a few things I talk about in what she presented, but really I'm trying to, as you'll see tonight, I'm really going to mainly focus on what we call positive emotions in Buddhism. I might even mention this before I get started, because I did have some time with Tenzin Choki when I was down at Land of Medicine Buddha. She lives in Santa Cruz, and so we got together, and these terms even of positive and negative, we might get into some fine points on that, and I'll get to that when we talk about that as part of tonight's lecture. But the idea is that there are different ways of looking at this, obviously, because a lot of what's presented in cultivating emotional balance is perhaps a bit more heavily grounded in Western psychology and a way of looking at things from what are emotions there. In Buddhism, emotions have a different connotation to them slightly. So this is something just to be forewarned about. And also, hopefully, if you did go to that course, did anyone go to the course with Tenzin Choki? Oh, good. Some folks that, and I'm sure it was a wonderful course. She's a wonderful teacher. So I'm glad that you did. And again, you will see again some differences in terms of how I'm presenting this. So I do have some slides for tonight and try not to put too many slides. But then when I started poking around the last day or so, I kept finding more and more things that I wanted to share. So again, science of happiness, cultivating positive emotions. And as I said, we'll talk a little bit later about differentiating a more Western approach to positive emotions versus a kind of Buddhist Eastern approach. All right. These are the four things that I want to be addressing tonight and Wednesday night. And tonight, I'm hoping that we'll get at least through the first three, believe it or not, and then we'll start looking at some of the positive emotions that are presented in Buddhism. I mean, that's really where my expertise is. I have some information and knowledge about Western science and psychology, about all of this. One book that I'm going to be citing is a really wonderful guide to working with positivity and positive emotions from a Western point of view. But the very first thing is defining happiness, which is what I had you meditate on, right? What is happiness? So I'm just curious what people came up with in your own thinking about that. Did you have anything that you'd like to share? Again, there's no pressure, but if somebody would like to share answers to any of that, what is happiness? How do we obtain happiness? What are the causes of that happiness? Anyone, anything you'd like to share? We do have a microphone, if you don't mind waiting for that, so the folks who are online and the recording will have all of that. So,
Okay. I kind of know better, but I think of, doing well in my work and in my way of life and taking pride in that.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
And escapism, like doing hedonistic habits that that I feel I deserve as a reward for
Mm-hmm.
working hard. Um, so yeah, I know those probably sound I don't know. Anyway,
No
but
judgment.
yeah, so I think that's pretty
Great,
much
Jandy.
it.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Great. I think those are all forms of happiness that we can definitely agree upon. Yes, yes, please, Gitu.
Yeah, so sometimes I find myself smiling for no reason, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's just situation I'm in, somebody I'm talking to, or whatever it is. But that's what I define as happiness, you know.
Right.
There's no active reason for it, but and it makes you smile and feel good.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Gitu. I think again that can be a part of happiness. Absolutely. Yes. Anyone else? Anything you'd like to share online? Anyone like to share anything on your reflections on what happiness is or how we get it? It's such a used word and maybe overused word, right? Happiness, happiness. I'm going to share with you in a moment a few quotes from a book called Happiness by Venerable Matthew Ricard, who's a Tibetan Buddhist monk in slightly different tradition than ours, but an esteemed scholar, an amazing a practitioner. I might mention he's actually said to be the happiest person on the planet. And that's because he's one of these folks that participated in some of the studies that they've done, where they put all the little pads all over the head and what have you, and they measure what's going on in your brain, what areas are lighting up, and all this. And he was meditating on compassion, actually, which is something we'll talk about later. But he was doing this very deep meditation, and all of these areas of the brain were lighting up to show like amazing well-being and peace and what have you. So he's gotten that moniker of like the happiest person on planet Earth. Um, but Ken, this is something that, as we're going to be exploring in Buddhist terms, we can attain those same things. We shouldn't think, oh, this amazing practitioner, and we could never be like him. That's kind of part of why I'm teaching, if not the whole reason why I'm teaching this subject, is really to give you some tools that you can work with to obtain those states of happiness and well-being, and maybe do your own experiment. Put all the little electrodes on your head and see what areas light up for you. Um, but happiness gets to be a little bit elusive. And certainly, often in Buddhism, we do talk about more temporal forms of happiness versus more ultimate forms of happiness. But I think all of them in the end up being things that we can say that there's a measure of happiness we gain from the outside world, from just being with others, enjoying our time with them, having certain stimuli in our field of experience that are enjoyable to partake of and what have you. But the forms of happiness that we really are driving for are those that are more internal and those that are not quite so conditional, where we know we can bring those states through inner practice as opposed to waiting for things to happen on the outside that are going to give us that happiness. This is the way that Matthew Ricard talks about happiness in his book, and I think it's just a really nice place to start. He says, by happiness, I mean here a deep sense of flourishing that arises from an exceptionally healthy mind. I like that definition a lot. A deep sense of flourishing that arises from an exceptionally healthy mind. Now, if your mind isn't exceptionally healthy, don't worry. Just healthy enough is probably good. Don't have to worry about it being exceptional. Um, but as he says, this is not a mere pleasurable feeling, a fleeting emotion, or a mood, but an optimal state of being. Yeah, I did a little course on this tour down at Land of Medicine Buddha, a weekend retreat on the eight pillars of joy. Part of the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu were spent 5 days together, and they put together this amazing book with these eight practices to get joy in your life. Joy is another elusive term, right? Joy, happiness. But what was interesting is they really got to a place of defining joy as the similar type of thing, something that is deep within us, that is a state of being and a state of living that is, again, an optimal place to be. And I think that's again, in terms of conventional terms, that sounds like a really good result to gain from our practice and what we're doing and what we're going to be investigating these 2 nights. Obviously, in Buddhism, we go even further and say we can develop amazing states of ultimate well-being. These are things that we call like Buddhahood, enlightenment, what have you. We'll talk about those a little bit, but for these 2 nights, I'm mainly just wanting to give you the tools that can help you to have some measure of well-being and happiness that, again, isn't so contingent. We tend to think that we're waiting for other things to come along to produce our happiness. If only I get that job, if only I had that partner, if only I had this, that, whatever, well, then I'd be happy. Well, we know from our experience, whenever we've had those thoughts, that we didn't really get the happiness we were seeking. Again, it was a fleeting experience. It was very temporary. I mean, look at the way things are marketed. I talked about that the other day, right? That you just have this continual bombardment of like new things that you can buy. iPhone 17, whatever they're up to, you need to get the new one because it's new and improved and has things that are different, as if that's going to really make you happy. Once more, our experience is different. We get these things and they don't really produce the happiness that we're seeking. And that's because I think deep down we're seeking something that is much more lasting, something that is in that nature of a more optimal way of being in the world and living our lives. This is, again, what Buddhism, I think, has to offer. Not to say that Western psychology doesn't, but I think there are some limitations and some differences in terms of how they approach this topic. So I will be sharing a little bit of both of those views. This is continuing on it. I like this part too, and this is the last bit I'm going to share from his book. It says, happiness is also a way of interpreting the world. Since while it may be difficult to change the world, it is always possible to change the way we look at it. This is, of course, he's Buddhist, so this is very Buddhist, what he's putting out there. We always have the opportunity to change how we see the world. But what's interesting, going back to those 8 pillars of joy, the first of the 8 pillars that His Holiness and the Archbishop came up with is perspective, because the way we see the world is how we then experience the world. If we want to look at the world as everybody's out to get me and I can't trust anybody and I should just, be cautious in everything I do, well, then that's the type of life that's going to unfold for you, is being very fearful and very having a lot of trepidation about whoever's around you or whatever you're doing. If you have a heart that's full of loving kindness and open and to all the world and always seeing beings through that lens, well, then you're going to have a very different experience in your life. And that's just very much, again, what Buddhism is all about, is changing our minds. You can change the outside world sometimes and do things that will modify what you're experiencing, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just see it for what it is, which is simply just a shift in something that's only going to be temporary. It might alleviate that problem in the moment, but is it getting to the deeper source of our well-being? Probably not. Again, because those are within ourselves. They're not done by adjusting the outside world. So this is the idea behind happiness that we're going to be looking at over these 2 nights. Is everybody in the right room then? Are we looking for the same thing? Hopefully. And if not, well, then just work with this and see what that's like to entertain that idea. As I said, it still can be a very temporal form of happiness. To have happiness throughout this life, I think, means living in a space of good, optimal well-being and feeling like everything is, kind of working for you in terms of our conventional world. There are deeper states, as I said, that Buddhism teaches, and the center here provides many courses that move in that direction, give the teachings for more ultimate states of well-being, what we call nirvana, Buddhahood, and so on. The second topic, that's the first one already. That's why, again, we think we'll be getting through the first 3 at least tonight and some of the fourth. Delineating positive and negative emotions then. So, okay, if we say that our goal is to attain happiness, happiness then comes from within, well, it must come from our mental landscape then. It must come from what we are cultivating in our minds. If it's an internal quality, then it's generally dependent upon internal factors. Little quote here. This is from the Dalai Lama and Venerable Thupten Chodron. They've been writing a series of books that are really quite phenomenal. They're not necessarily beginner books in some ways. I think they're going to be publishing the 10th volume of this series. It's quite outstanding that they've been able to do this. This is in, I think, the very first one, Approaching the Buddhist Path. They say, While both Buddhism, and I inserted Western psychology because that's the implication here, because we do have what we call Buddhist psychology. That's what I'm sharing with you in this course as well. While they both seek to help people have more happiness and fulfillment and decrease their unhappiness and misery, they differ somewhat in what they consider positive and negative emotions. Again, positive being in general the term that we're going to give to those things that contribute to our happiness and well-being, negative being the things that detract from that. I'm going to have a different way of approaching that to some degree. Again, I'm no expert in Western psychology. I've never studied it to a great degree other than the few books that I've read. So if I'm saying things that aren't in agreement with all of Western psychology, know that that's probably the case because there's a lot of changes in Western psychology even. I might mention the whole field of positive psychology is relatively new, you know. So this is kind of something that is growing and developing in that field of study. They go on to say, some psychologists and scientists I have spoken with say that a negative emotion is one that feels bad and makes the person unhappy at the time it is manifest in the mind. A positive emotion makes the person feel happy at the time it is manifest. Well, there's something kind of, simplistic about that to some degree, but it makes some sense, right? If I have an emotion in my mind that makes me smile and brings some pleasure to my thoughts and state of well-being, it seems like it's supporting my happiness. And if I have something that makes me kind of sad or it feels kind of bad, well, then that's detracting from my happiness, making me, again, unhappy. What's the problem there? I mean, we do run into some things that are actually, in Buddhist terms, really good for our well-being over the long term, but might be kind of difficult to work with. I mean, we're just talking about compassion. Matthew Ricard being this amazing practitioner who's able to meditate on compassion, and all these parts of his brain light up that he's really happy. Well, you might think, how is that working? Because compassion is actually looking at suffering and observing that suffering and kind of suffering with. That's what the word compassion actually means, to suffer with. So if you're suffering with somebody, you're observing them and they're going through all these various horrible, miserable things, how does that induce happiness? It's not a good feeling. It's not kind of fitting in that definition. So there is a difference in terms of the way that these things are approached. And that's why I wanted to make sure, again, when we talk about positive emotions, we need to delineate which ones are positive and negative in which contexts. This is actually a little bit I found on the internet. This is from the one person we're going to be referring to quite a bit in the section here on the Western science view, Barbara Fredrickson. She's done a lot of research on positivity, positive emotions, and this is according to her and someone named Cohn. They say positive emotions can be defined as pleasant, multi-component response tendencies. That's a more technical definition than what I can explain, perhaps. They are multi-component because they involve more than just our internal feelings. They also include changes in our nervous system, happiness hormones, facial expressions, thoughts, and more. So, there's actually, even talking about facial expressions, there's Paul Ekman, who is a good friend of the Dalai Lama's. I think he lives in the Bay Area, doesn't he? Or somewhere in California, I'm pretty sure. He has done like that facial recognition where he can tell what emotions are going on the basis of small changes in your face. And there was even a TV show, I think called Lie to Me or something, where where this guy had that ability to look at faces and could tell when people were lying or not and what was going on with them. This is whole science. I really find it refreshing that we have this amazing body of work that's going on in Western psychology about positivity and emotions and trying to get at things that are kind of more exciting and interesting. Traditionally, Western psychology has been very much about pathology, about what is wrong and trying to fix what is wrong. This whole orientation, and I'm not in any way putting it down, it's just a slightly different approach. It is very much accentuating what are the positive things that bring about greater well-being. What are the emotions that we should be cultivating on a daily basis? And I would certainly, I'm not going to be presenting all of the information on that as part of this because, again, it's not really my expertise per se. But I would encourage you, if you have an interest in that, to, read up on it. And there are certainly a lot of things out there that can support what Western psychology has to say. But it is primarily intended to get us to the emotions that feel good. When I share the 10 that Barbara Fredrickson highlights a little bit later tonight, you'll see that they all tend to be things we'd put in the positive register, if you will. Whereas the negative register are the things that are a little more painful, hard, difficult to look at. There can be great value to looking at those according to Buddhism. And I think probably Barbara Fredrickson and all these other folks would say, yes, absolutely, we agree. Compassion and all these things can be positive, but they tend to be more positive in the long term. Initially, they are a little challenging, right? To look at suffering in the way that compassion does, this is really quite a difficult thing to do initially. So let's go back a bit into a few more quotes from His Holiness and Venerable Chodron. In Buddhism, what differentiates positive and negative emotions is not our immediate feeling of happiness or discomfort, but the happiness or suffering that is the long-term result of these emotions. That if we are able to put ourselves, I'm just going to use compassion as an example. It's on my list of things I'm going to be working with tonight and Wednesday night. But if we work with exposing ourselves to that suffering and seeing that suffering and identifying with that suffering and really being with that suffering, it does produce feelings of well-being in the long term. In the moment, again, quite painful and difficult. So this is a differentiation that I really want to make between what we call positive and negative in these two disciplines that, again, both have their merits. I'm not denying that Western psychology and the scientific approach to all of this is without merit, because it certainly does have that. He goes on to say, that is because the long-term effects of our actions are considered more important than their short-term effects, which tend to be fleeting in comparison. Because we look at the other side of it too. When we say, okay, positive emotions are defined as those things that are really producing happiness in our mind, feelings of happiness, elated thoughts, whatever we want to call them. Well, there can be some things that aren't quite good on that side either, that we don't want to subscribe positive qualities to them. In that book of joy, they talk about how joy has, 15, 16 different shades to it. One of them is they have that German term, Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is taking delight in someone else's misery and suffering. Right? Maybe the political opponent, that of the other side, and then something happens to that person, you might take delight because you don't like them and you don't want them to win or whatever. So that's not a very healthy feeling, but it produces happiness in us, right? We could say it's positive from that point of view, a Western psychology point of view, but it's not really a positive thing to cultivate. Buddhism would say, actually, that's one of the worst things we can do is kind of take delight and rejoice in someone else's misfortune. It's kind of naughty of us. So, all right. So this is kind of to understand that once more this measure, and I don't think, again, Western psychology is necessarily being that strict and saying that Schadenfreude is a positive emotion that you should cultivate. I don't think that's what they're saying. But they're saying once more that we can generally define positive emotions because they're producing some feeling of, well-being in the moment. You kind of bring some joy, some spark of happiness to you. Whereas those things that are negative do the opposite. So we're going to go a little bit further with this and talk about Buddhism more, obviously. If in the long term an emotion produces unpleasant experiences, it is considered negative. If it brings happiness in the long term, it is positive. And now remember, we're talking happiness being what we defined earlier from Matthew Ricard, this deeper sense of well-being, an optimal state of well-being. If that is what one gains through long-term cultivation of these emotions, then we would call them positive. So even though compassion, that example that I've been using, even though that is very difficult to turn our attention towards suffering and to be with suffering, it is having long-term effects that are really worthwhile. Compassionate beings in our world are wonderful to be around. If you get an opportunity to be around His Holiness the Dalai Lama or our spiritual director, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he was around, he passed away, not quite 2 years ago now, about a year and a half ago. And, he was an amazing being to be in the presence of. And he wasn't depressing and morbid because he, has amazing compassion and seeing the suffering of the world. He was delightful. He was joyful. This comes about because of the sustained practice of these. It's not something you can expect in the moment, though. The more immediate effects will always be a little bit more negative. So this is important to get in terms of what I'm going to be talking about, is to really understand that's the approach that we're taking. Buddhism explains that virtuous, and I'm going to use the synonym sometimes of positive, constructive, wholesome, these emotions lead to happiness in the long term, while non-virtuous, negative, destructive, unwholesome emotions lead to suffering. And we're defining happiness and suffering here just in terms of a feeling of well-being that we call happiness, and a feeling of being not so not so well off that we call suffering. That is a more state of being miserable or in pain, anguish, what have you. I know Buddhism, we talk about suffering having a wider definition, but that's not what we're using in this course. We're talking about simply those two feelings. In some way, we can say that these are really kind of feeling tones that we're after, but they're more than that, once more. And happiness certainly is more than that. It's not just the feeling tone of happiness that we have that is arising in our mind on the basis of whatever we're experiencing. We are talking about those deeper states of well-being that we can cultivate over time, whereas we just become more miserable if we follow those negative emotions. By negative emotions in Buddhism, we're going to talk about them in terms of their opposites, because this course, I really want to focus on the positive stuff. I did a course here, Joe and I had dinner, and we were talking about how the first course that he did with me here at Ocean of Compassion back in 2017, you said, right? Yeah. It was all about, the joy of letting go of our negative habits. And we were talking about how to address our negative habits. It's interesting, though, because in Buddhism, how do you address the negative habits? It's often by cultivating the positive habits. And so which side you look at doesn't matter so much as acquiring the skills and the abilities to address this imbalance that we have. We tend to follow things that are not so good for us, unwholesome thoughts and behaviors and so on that really don't lead to happiness. We think they do, perhaps, because even some of those, once more, can have a happiness result in the moment, but they only lead to suffering down the way. Because we start following these patterns of thinking and being, and they don't produce ultimate well-being at all. Don't even produce temporal well-being for, the long term in our lives. So this is the point behind this, really to subscribe to this particular point of view, which has its differences, once more, from Western psychology. Oh, I forgot my little, Babe, would you mind running? There's in my the bag that's there, there's like a plastic sheet with some paper in it. You'll see it in the large pocket that should be open. Thank you for doing that. This is a little parable that you may have heard this before, and if you've heard it, well, hope you enjoy hearing it again. But I first came across this in reading a book by Pema Chodron. Did you find it okay? Yeah. No, no, no. It's in a plastic sleeve that's like some papers. It should be right next to where that one was. Sorry, I should have just gone myself. That's it. Perfectly. Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll read the version of it because otherwise, if I try to paraphrase, it's always, a little iffy. Just like telling a joke, right? You really want to just read it rather than make it up yourself. An old Cherokee chief was teaching his grandson about life, and he said, "A fight is going on inside me," he said to the boy. "It is a terrible fight, and it is between two wolves. One is evil. He is anger, envy, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, self-doubt, ego. The other is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. This same fight is going on inside you and inside every other person too." The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, "Well, which wolf will win?" The old chief simply replied, "The one you feed." And this is what we're talking about in terms of, I mentioned negative, positive emotions and the polar opposites of these, that essentially if we feed the negative thoughts, the negative emotions, all of these things that simply produce more suffering, well, then that's what's going to win out. It's your choice. Do you want to keep feeding that wolf? I know it sounds horrible to starve a wolf. We don't necessarily want to starve a wolf, but when it's our own minds that are at stake here and our own experiences, we want to feed the wolf that is good. We want to put our energy into that. We want to make sure that what we do supports the longer term well-being and well-being of others as well. And it is kind of interesting. In Buddhist terms, we often see our well-being and the well-being of others as intimately connected. That if we are concerned about the well-beings of others, then we do benefit. Positive emotions, as we're going to see, tend to be the things that are concerned about the well-being of others. Whereas the negative emotions tend to be the things that are only concerned about me and what I need and what I want. We're going to see that as we get into these. But this is the two wolves that we all have. I'm not trying to make it too dualistic, but it's really quite true. The things that we bring us happiness, the things that don't, the things that do the opposite. So thank you for getting this for me. I appreciate that very much. So let's go ahead. Are there any questions on this? But I think this is the end of this little section on delineating these two. I think it's hopefully made it quite clear. Questions? Yeah, please.
Oh, was it me or someone else wanted to ask a question? Yes, I do. I mean, I didn't want to just, jump in the middle, right?
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think this is one of the thoughts was coming to my mind is there are certain things which are very obvious, like, a happy dog wants to play. Yeah, you're going to feel happy. Anyone's going to feel happy, or someone comes with the bad news. You're not, you're going to feel sad. But how do you take something that's very neutral, and then for some people they're happy and someone else might look at it and may not be happy? And a friend of mine that comes to my mind is every time I talk to him, he will, if it's raining, he'll say, oh, it's beautiful here, it's raining, and I just made a cup of tea and I'm enjoying it. And then the next time when I call him, and I'm thinking, like, how come it's not raining here? And then next time I talk to him, he says, "Oh, it's warm. It's really warm. It's fantastic. I'm in my shorts, and we're going to go to the beach and going to have a great time." And then I keep thinking, how come he has such a good life, And but that's that comes to my mind that and what I've seen is also, like, last thing I want to say is like some personal observation is, if I'm and trying to think about when are the times where something neutral makes me feel happy or whatever. And if the previous day, if I've been on a long bike ride, or if I've gone and helped at some, like, charity center, or done something of that nature, then it's sort of it's not like an instant happiness when I'm actually doing those things, but the next day there is a sense of peace where these neutral things feel, you're in a good mood. That's what I feel like. It's a mood, you're in a nice mood. So anyway, I just wanted to share some of these thoughts.
No, and I think, again, we can see with the first thing that you mentioned to us that you have somebody who has got a sense of contentment with regard to whatever is going on, and doesn't have that contingency of, oh, if it only has to be, if it's sunny, then I'll be happy. But if it's rainy, then I'll be miserable. And we do tend to once more have that way of dividing up our lives and thinking, if we get it our way, then we'll be happy. If we don't get it our way, then we're going to be miserable. Well, that becomes once more that pattern of everything being contingent, our happiness being contingent on external conditions. We don't have much control over the external conditions. We can't, turn off the weather and say, okay, stop raining. I need some sunlight for a while. It just doesn't work that way, right? So if you have a more balanced mind, which I think is what we're aiming for when we describe happiness in this way, then you can be okay with whatever's going on. Yeah, in terms of these moods, I mean, once more, we can see that there's some conditionality there, but we can get a feeling for how sometimes it even happens. I mean, look at great athletes. You might be a great athlete in terms of your bike riding. I'm not putting you down by saying, but I'm talking like people who are like Olympic athletes. That must be really grueling, the work that they do to perfect their art. When they are out there, if it's like an Olympic bicyclist or whatever, they are pushing themselves to the limit constantly, right? I mean, something that would be absolutely miserable for me. I don't have that kind of mentality to go towards that type of activity. But for them, there's this incredible joy, especially how they feel upon accomplishing something like that and really pushing themselves to those incredible limits, right? So once more, we can see that there's ways that neutral or even quite difficult experiences can sometimes also be seen in a very positive light afterwards, or can produce positive effects afterwards. So we're not so caught up in it. I don't know, but there's also, of course, things that people interpret in vastly different ways, right? Because something that brings happiness, one man's happiness is another man's misery, and another man's misery is another man's happiness. Who knows? But that once more just shows that things are really quite contingent. There's nothing sort of inherently there that we can look to and say, these are the ultimate sources of happiness outside of ourselves. When it comes to inside of ourselves, then I think we can be quite definite. We can say, as we're going through in this course, these are the things that will produce happiness in the long term if we invest in them and do what we can to cultivate them. And these are the things that are going to bring more misery to you over time if you continue to cultivate your mind in that way. So there is something outside, it can be variable. It can be extremely variable. Some things can be really delightful for some people and miserable for others and so on. Inside, I think there are some definite things that we can say will have the same intended effect as long as one practices it and practice it genuinely. Yeah. So was there another question or comment? Jandy, did you have something? I wasn't clear. Okay. All right. Anyone online? Let's move on to our next section then. I do want to talk a little bit, as much as, again, this is not my expertise, so I'm kind of giving you that caveat about a scientific perspective on positive emotions. As I said, I'm going to mainly use a book called Positivity by Barbara L. Fredrickson. Barbara Fredrickson is at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I first came across this book quite some years ago, and it's studies. They've actually done scientific studies again around positivity. And on the basis of I'm not going to go into the whole description of all the various how these were done, but they did involve people who were living their daily lives, who were registering on some way of writing, marking what was going on for them throughout their days and the measure of happiness that they would say on the basis of what was going on. And they found, as they're doing more research on positive emotions and what she's calling here positivity, 6 vital facts about positivity, which I think are worth sharing because, again, we'll get to eventually defining what she means by positivity, the 10 forms of positivity. But these also inform the next part of it, where we talk about her theory, which is called the broaden and build theory. The first one, just going to say in the next slide, this might be kind of obvious that positivity feels good. And we've already talked about how that's a good part of how they define positivity in Western circles. The first fact may seem almost too obvious to mention, but it's essential. It's the sparkle of good feelings, after all, that awakens your motivation to change. You begin to yearn for more good days like this. And she's putting it out there as, that main impetus that when we start having positive experiences with regard to the emotions that we are cultivating, the things that we are doing, then we become hungry for more. Then we actually put more energy into doing those things. So it's not just that they produce a good feeling, but we begin to want that feeling. We begin to move towards that feeling. There's something similar. Again, maybe later we'll talk about the Buddhist view of some of these. We don't want to once more become like a junkie or something. I mean, a junkie probably feels wonderful feelings when they shoot up or do whatever, take whatever drug that is going to induce more euphoric feelings for them, right? We're not talking about that type of pattern, because I'm sure she'd also consider that to be extremely unhealthy way of obtaining happiness. So we're not talking about continuing to crave more and more of an unhealthy way of getting one's happiness, but rather we begin to see these more genuine ways of cultivating it, which once more she'll describe in terms of 10 different positive emotions that she has highlighted and found scientific evidence are very much a part of these 6 facts. The second one, that positivity actually changes how your mind works. This is quite interesting, because I would say in Buddhism, we would certainly subscribe to this. Positivity doesn't just change the contents of your mind, trading bad thoughts for good ones. It also changes the scope or boundaries of your mind. It widens the span of possibilities that you see. This is going to come into play in her broaden and build theory, but the idea is that we become much more creative in our thinking and in our way of approaching the world when we cultivate positive emotions. Kind of makes some sense. The mind becomes a bit more spacious. Whereas if we look at the negative tendencies that we have, they contract the mind so much. we only kind of get on one little track that we're on all the time and that we only see, again, the world through that lens. There's a lot more room for positive, complementary thoughts, things that increase our well-being as we continue to work with these positive states of mind. So it actually changes the way that you think. Kind of getting into this is one thing I'll just emphasize here, take it off screen for a moment. Most of you have heard this term, neuroplasticity, that essentially our brains are not hardwired at any point. It's kind of amazing that they used to think that this was even the case when you think about it, because we all know that we change in terms of our thinking, and maybe it's like even the tastes that you had or the things that you were interested in at one point in your life are very different later. But the idea is that you can rewire your brain. Neuroplasticity means that the brain will modify itself based on the thoughts you introduce to it. Now, of course, Western science and looking at the brain and consciousness thinking, whatever, all of that, they have a hard time with it because they often are saying that the consciousness is a product of the brain. And so how is the consciousness changing the brain when the consciousness arises from the brain? But nonetheless, they've been beginning to see this interactive circle. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he first started meeting with Western scientists, neuroscientists, and what have you, he would ask them, he said, there is the brain and the mind, what we call the mind or consciousness. And most of them were talking about how changes in the brain, such as decreasing certain hormones or increasing certain hormones or whatever, that can induce different conscious experiences. And he says, but does it also work the other way, where if you change conscious experiences, you can change the brain? And at that time, when he was meeting with them, I don't know, this is probably 40 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, they were saying, no, that's not possible. But neuroplasticity shows it is possible. And you get all of these neurons, whatever, to wire differently on the basis of what you're thinking. In Buddhism, we would say that there's an interdependency between these two, between the brain and the mind. But mind is really primary in that this is where we should put all of our money. Enlightenment or these great goals don't come about by changing your brain, fine-tuning your brain. They have to do with working with our minds. That's, again, part of that definition of happiness that we saw earlier. It's very much a product of our mental well-being, states of well-being that aren't contingent upon other external or even the, brain factors, things that are material. Positivity transforms your future. This is part of the broaden and build theory too, in terms of creating opportunities that go beyond just the moment, that really, make us much more flexible, much more adaptable. Although good feelings will forever be fleeting, she says, over time, positivity literally brings out the best in you. And this is, again, something that Buddhism would subscribe to as well, is that the more that you cultivate positive emotions, the better you become, the happier you become, the more things that are open to you in terms of building more resilience, skill, courage, whatever it takes to be more resilient in this world. And this is definitely what they're seeing in Western science. Number 4, positivity puts the brake on negativity. That might sound, again, a bit obvious, but nonetheless, it's an important point. And in Buddhism, we would once more say the same thing. That's what I was mentioning earlier, that in Buddhism, because of the way we look at positive and negative emotions have an antidote in the sense, which is the positive emotion that is the direct counterforce. So compassion, for example, would be the counterforce to having a sense of kind of cruelty, being, totally looking at suffering and having no response or even taking a delight in suffering, what have you. Whereas, all of the various negative emotions have their counterparts. This is what she says in terms of this positivity puts the brake on negativity. She says, in a heartbeat, negativity can spike your blood pressure, but positivity can calm it. It works like a reset button. So the idea here is she focuses a bit more on what goes on in the body, but this is showing, again, negative thoughts and emotions and whatever in Western science are those that cause our health to even go out of whack, whereas the positive ones calm the mind. Positivity obeys a tipping point. I have a few more slides on this because, we might not know this term so well, a tipping point. What's a tipping point? This is how this works. She says, the most stunning and practical fact to emerge from the science of positivity is that its effects are nonlinear. This is not science as usual. There's no single arrow shooting from cause to effect. Arrows abound and they bend, loop, and shoot from both ends at once. I'm not sure what all that means, but the idea is that it's not linear. We're actually talking about things that become larger the longer that you go, and they become greater and greater than what a linear track would show. Just got more on this. In traditional linear science, proportionality rules. No matter where you start, if you change the input by a certain amount, the outputs change in proportion. You add so much to it, it goes up by that much. You add so much to it, it goes up by that much. Here, what happens though, in nonlinear science, where you start makes a huge difference. If you're starting further along after having done all of this and looking at the effects then, the effects are much greater later on because of this nonlinear kind of enlargement. Effects that are virtually non-existent at one starting point grow disproportionately large at a different starting point. A tipping point is that sweet spot in between where a small change makes a big difference. So what happens here is they say that as you increase the positivity and positive emotions, that you can actually create these fast results to where even just a small increment produces a huge result. It's not linear. It's not in a linear way of looking at cause and effect. It's almost like the way we talk about karma in Buddhism, right? It's non-linear. So this is, I think, an important thing to remember, because I think in Buddhism, we would say this is very true as well. It kind of becomes a larger force over time because that becomes the nature of our being. You can increase your positivity. Well, this, of course, we know in Buddhism very well. The potential for life-draining negativity lies within you, just as does the potential for life-giving positivity. You have more say than you think about which you feel and when. So again, it's up to us. Buddhism would very much check off that box too, right? We always say, again, how much change we want to do is entirely up to us. You can change your mind to extreme degrees. Going to see this in we get to the next section and we start talking about positive and negative emotions in terms of Buddhism, especially positive emotions. The treasure of your own positivity is waiting. You can tip the scales to unleash your life's potential to flourish. So, on the basis of that, she built this broaden and build theory. This is a theory, but it's gotten a lot of weight in Western psychology from what I can tell and looking on the internet, what have you. And she says, as I developed this new theory, I challenged deeply held assumptions within my field. I went beyond what my mentors had taught me. And I'm going to explain this in a moment. While I agreed that the concept of specific action tendencies was useful, my sense was that it held value only for negative emotions. What this theory is, as best as I can summarize it, which again, it's a Buddhist teacher's view of it, is that this whole idea, I've got to get that phrase there again, it was a specific action tendencies. What they say in the field of Western psychology, they generally would say that most of our emotions are there because they help us to do a particular thing on the basis of them arising. They use the example of when we were, wandering on the plains of the Serengeti and having, lots of dangers around us, right? And so we had fear, for example, arising because it was there to help us to remove ourselves from places of danger so that we would survive and we could pass on our genetics to our, ancestors, what have you. I mean, it all was based on this whole idea that emotions play a role. They have a utilitarian function. Again, that specific action tendencies. But they kind of, for the longest time, they put everything in that category, saying both positive and negative emotions have that. But then you get to like the positive ones and you go, well, okay, what's the specific action tendency for, joy or for gratitude or for any of these others? What she found is that this really only explains those negative emotions. And that when it comes to positive emotions, there's a different way to look at them in terms of what she's calling the broaden and build theory, which we've touched on a little bit just by looking at those 6 points. That the purpose, if you will, of our positive emotions is to broaden and build in the ways that she's described, rather than to alert us to engaging in particular specific action tendencies, right? Weird term. All right, let's go ahead and look at how she describes this because I think it'll come get hopefully even clearer through her words. To fully understand the value of positive emotions, I had to chart a new course. I propose that unlike negative emotions, which narrow people's ideas about possible actions, positive emotions do the opposite. They broaden people's ideas about possible actions, opening our awareness to a wider range of thoughts and actions than is typical. So again, that broadening is the idea that we are able to have many more options available to us because we're coming from, again, a more creative, spacious place. Whereas the narrow negative tendencies drive us into doing the same thing again and again without really feeling many other possibilities, any other options. Positivity opens us is the first of these two concepts, broaden. Positivity, the first core truth about positive emotions is that they open our hearts and minds, making us more receptive and more creative. When I first came across this, I thought this was really quite amazing. I mean, Buddhism doesn't talk about it in those terms, but I think that's what we are really trying to do with our Buddhist practice of cultivating more positive emotions, is we want to broaden our kind of our repertoire of ways of responding in, I don't know, whatever words, to the world, being engaged in the world. Whatever it is that comes into our field of experience, we have a different way of looking at it and a new way of dealing with it, working with it. And that flexibility comes about through deeper cultivation, so that we're not, once more, in this kind of negative track that's going to drive us into more habitual, reactive ways of looking at things. Then, to go on to explain the build side of it, whereas the narrowed mindset sparked by negative emotions were valuable in instances that threatened our ancestors' survival in some way, the broadened mindsets sparked by positive emotions were valuable to our ancestors in a different ways and over longer time scales. So when she looked, when we don't know everything that our ancestors in terms of early human development, what they were going through, but this is the theory that what they were able to do by cultivating stronger emotions, and when they were connecting with each other's in family units or tribes or whatever, they were able to induce this sort of thing, be valuable in other ways that help people to, over longer terms, develop more resilience and skill and abilities. That's the idea behind the build, is that the build over time produces those greater and greater results. Again, that exponential thing where things become much larger, not linear. So broadened mindsets mattered because over time, such expansive awareness served to build our human ancestors' resources, spurring on their development of assets, abilities, and useful traits. We can say a lot of the creativity, no doubt, that came out of early man in terms of the development of tools and wheels and other resources and what have you, came out of that broadening rather than, I'm sorry, out of having that broadened mind, but out of the building. All of the building occurred on the basis of these two factors, the broaden and build theory. So this is the second statement that she makes. Positivity transforms us for the better. By opening our hearts and minds, positive emotions allow us to discover and build new skills, new ties, new knowledge, and new ways of being. So I like this theory, and there's a depiction of it, actually, that we'll get to in a moment. But let me finish off her little summary of here. These two core truths about positive emotions define her broaden and build theory, which holds that positive emotions were consequential to our human ancestors because over time, those good feelings broadened our ancestors' mindsets and built their resources for the future. And you might think, well, what do our ancestors have to do with us? Well, we can have the same thing. Positivity transformed early humans for the better, leaving them with extra measures of physical, social, intellectual, and psychological resources. The sparkle of good feelings enticed early humans to broaden and build when they felt safe and satisfied. Those who gave in to this pull became better prepared to survive future threats to life and limb. Those who didn't fared less well. Over millennia, natural selection sculpted our ancestors' capacity to experience heartfelt positivity, creating the form and function of the positive emotions that we modern-day humans experience. So she's just kind of, I think your words are pretty straightforward. She's essentially saying that, these things over time became what we have come to call positive emotions in our human world, that we all can see there's some benefit to, even though we don't know for sure what happened with our early ancestors. And this is the depiction of those. This is the positive spiral. The spiral looks the same, it's just which direction you're going in. Here you're going from a less, and don't need necessarily we need to read all the little words on the side, and that's probably even beyond what I can explain. The whole thing about through kind of being more positive and paying attention to our positive emotions is that by moving upward in that way, everything becomes much larger. We build and broaden the mind, having greater resources that we can draw from. All of the positive emotions, help to decrease all of the negative tendencies, the stress and anxiety that come from the tighter part of the spiral that we are originally coming from. Whereas if we go in the downward direction, if we have more negative traits and tendencies, negative emotions, then it only makes our mind tighter and tighter and our repertoire tighter and tighter in terms of the things we can do. More stress, more narrowing of the mind and our experience. So again, it's just a depiction that might be helpful as something to relate to in terms of this concept. These are the 10 that she describes in her book as being 10 forms of positivity. I'm not going to go into great depth on them, but you'll notice 3 of them are in green. That's because they are replicated to some degree in the Buddhist ones that we're going to talk about. Joy. Joy it becomes a little weird because it's almost like putting happiness on the list. But joy does have some delineations of the ways that we could talk about it. And in Buddhism, we're going to talk about it in a very specific way. Gratitude, we know gratitude, this feeling some gratefulness, appreciation for the people and things that we have in our lives. Serenity. Again, serenity, we might say, is an important quality to have. I don't know that in Buddhism we talk about it quite as a positive emotion that we'd want to develop, but being serene, somewhat peaceful in one's mind, this is an important quality. Interest, some curiosity about things, if you will, that drives us to engage things in a deeper way. They call that a positive emotion, but once more, I don't think Buddhism would necessarily line up completely with that. Hope is an interesting one because we don't use the word hope quite so much in Buddhism. In fact, they say sometimes hope can be our enemy because it becomes, if it's too much of just a hope that things are going to get better without the actions that drive it in that direction, then it's a pretty empty thought. It's not really doing much. But we know how hope can be a very positive emotion for many people. The hope that this will happen, that other things will go on that will be of benefit. Pride is an interesting one because pride here, I think they really are meaning a form of kind of self-confidence that we develop on the basis of good things that we have done and that we can acknowledge within our own experience. Pride in Buddhism is usually a delusion. We often talk about it in that way, though it's not always, but nonetheless, we can see how pride could become very distorted. So that's a tricky one for me, but I think I get what she means here in terms of the pride, even the pride we take in other people's accomplishments, right? Like if you have a child who does really well in their soccer game or something, you might be like really excited for them and take pride in what they've done and what have you. Amusement. Maybe we don't have much amusement in Buddhism. I like to try to interject it when I can, but amusement can become frivolous too, right? Where we're just like sitting around laughing and giggling all night and not really doing much of any benefit. But amusement is a good source of connection. One of the 8 pillars of joy, again, is humor, because humor does unite people and bring them together. And in humor, at least, that is about kind of being able to laugh at ourselves, not laughing at others in a malicious way, the way that is going on in our political arena that's so disturbing, right? Because amusement is a time of lightness, a time of bringing people together. So it does feel good, obviously. It's a good positive emotion in that regard. But as I said, it could become frivolous. Inspiration, we definitely see this in Buddhism. I didn't put it on my list simply because inspiration can have a lot of different connotations. We even use sometimes the word aspiration, which is more of a wishing, moving us in a particular direction. But to be inspired by certain things, this can often, again, feel quite positive. Awe, there's actually a book that came out not that long ago about awe. One of the people involved with Greater Good Science Center out of Berkeley. Awe is something we don't talk about very much, and his whole premise is that we need more awe in our lives. It's kind of interesting when the Northern Lights came down so far south this year. That's something to be awed at often, right? Like just this awe of like looking at something that's this magical phenomenon that appears in the sky just due to the way light is refracting and all this other stuff. I don't know. It is a very positive emotion, and maybe we do need more awe in our lives. But nonetheless, in Buddhism, I don't think we talk about awe that much. Love, well, love has a lot of different connotations too. We can talk about romantic love, that we can feel very happy in the midst of falling in love in that way. But in Buddhism, we might consider that more a form of attachment. Love is just a genuine wish for another's well-being, is what we're going to talk about in terms of love from a Buddhist perspective. But I find these 10 kind of interesting because again, if we go back to what was described earlier, all of these are something that is a positive feeling tone, right? You know, the awe is this like delight at looking at something and the inspiration and the, joy and pride and all these. We feel good when these emotions are there. As I said, Buddhism, not all the emotions are going to be something that makes us feel good in the moment. But by sustaining and practicing them over long periods of time, we can see greater well-being. Okay, I think that is everything in regard to scientific perspective. Let's get started on the Buddhist perspective. Again, I'm going to choose 10 emotions that we're going to work with. What I'm going to have in regard to Buddhist perspective is we're going to first look at this process by which our positive emotions can free us from the destructive ones. As I mentioned in Buddhism, there's an antidotal quality to these. If we really focus on the positive ones, we can diminish and eventually even eliminate the negative ones. And I think that's an important message to get across. Whether you feel that's what you're here for or not, that's your own decision. We can certainly see some reduction of our destructive emotions when we cultivate the positive ones. I'm going to touch on something called the 4 great efforts very briefly and some of the skills that we need to practice those efforts, and then go into the 10 positive emotions. We'll see again how much time I actually have for those tonight. For this, I'm using some passages by the Dalai Lama. This is actually, I believe, one of the first sets of teachings that was ever published in the West in English. Jeffrey Hopkins, who died this year, great translator and scholar, he translated for His Holiness on this tour. They became the teachings known as kindness, clarity, and insight. He says it is necessary for us to familiarize with and get used to good attitudes, or again, positive emotions. But our habituation to bad emotions, such as hatred, makes a huge obstacle. Thus, we need to identify the various forms of bad afflictive emotions and combat them right on the spot. Again, in Buddhist terms, we combat them by cultivating their opposite. So he's going to use hatred as the main example as we go through this, which is pretty strong emotion, but nonetheless, we can see how it works in terms of that. If you gradually become accustomed to controlling bad attitudes over a period of years, it is possible even for someone who often used to get angry to become quite calm. That's the evidence that we can see. If we actually practice working with some of these things, developing a more patient mind and so on, we can see our anger diminish and eventually can be pretty much non-existent. They say eventually, if we practice the Buddhist path fully, we can completely eliminate these afflictive emotions such as anger and so on. Is it possible to get rid of the afflictive emotions completely, or is it possible only to suppress them? What I was just saying, and we might think it's only possible to suppress them, and I think Western psychology would say it's not possible to get rid of them completely. They just don't have the tools to be able to do that. But from the Buddhist point of view, he says the conventional nature of the mind is what we call clear light. In other words, our consciousnesses are clear, just temporarily clouded by these emotions. And thus, defilements do not reside in the very nature of the mind. Defilements are this wonderful term, adventitious, temporary, they can be removed. Adventitious means that they're there only because the conditions to oppose them have not been introduced. So essentially what Buddhism says is our minds are like a glass of water. I always use this example. So if you can imagine a glass of water here, if I were to go out and find some dirt out in the yard, where the bushes are and that, and I spoon the dirt into the water and I mix it up, the water becomes opaque, right? We don't have the clarity of the water appearing to us. But the clarity of the water is there under the surface because we can run that through a very fine filter, and all of the dirt and the sediment and whatever will be taken out, and the clarity of the water is manifest again. That's what our minds are like. Now you might wonder, well, where did the dirt in my mind come from? That's a whole nother issue that Buddhism doesn't really have an answer to, other than saying the dirt was always there, because they hold that our minds have always been there. That's a whole nother thing we don't want to necessarily get into that much in the course of these 2 sessions. But that's the Buddhist perspective, that our minds have been polluted by these afflictive emotions, these destructive emotions, since beginningless time. And that is not the nature of our minds. The nature of our minds is clear. We call it clear light, but the idea is that it is a clarity that is, although these things arise within the mind, just like the dirt that's in the water, they are not of the nature of the mind, meaning that they can be removed. Again, the process of removal he's going to go into and talk about, like how do we actually do that? But that's the premise for Buddhist thinking about how we work with our emotions, is that all of our emotions that are difficult, destructive, what have you, they're all just there adventitiously, and they can be gotten rid of. How wonderful. Happy day. This is the great news the Buddha taught, right? When he taught his very first teaching, that we don't have to have this state of having these destructive emotions in our minds. If afflictive emotions such as hatred were in the nature of the mind, then from its inception, the mind would always have to be hateful. For instance, since that would be its nature. So can we see that there's a proof right there? If hatred was in the nature of your mind, this destructive emotion, then you would have hatred all the time. Do you have hatred right now? I hope you don't have hatred right now. Hatred at me. So you don't have hatred, right? So hatred can't be the nature of your mind. Where does hatred come from? However, that this is not so is obvious. It is only under certain conditions that we become angry or hateful. And when those circumstances are not present, then that hatred or anger is not generated, right? So we do see a contingency here. We have like the seeds of these things in our minds, but they manifest only on the basis of certain conditions, certain circumstances. And therefore, the mind is not in the nature of those destructive emotions. We might say, oh, but then compassion's the same, right? Or loving kindness or whatever. They also arise only on the basis of certain conditions. Well, we're going to see that there's a difference, though, in regard to those, in regard to the validity of those states of mind versus what the minds of anger or hatred are. So what are the circumstances that serve as a basis for generating hatred? It is generated because we actually superimpose upon phenomena an unattractiveness or badness that exceeds what is actually there. And what do we mean by what is actually there? That's a whole nother debate. But we can say that there are certain things that do come into our field of experience that are negative for us. They're not negative for everybody necessarily, and that does show that there's a bit of conditionality with regard to that even. I mean, we'll use since we're all dealing with the stress around the election being like a week from now, let's talk about whoever is the other candidate for you. I don't want to make any assumptions about who's in the room or what your political beliefs are. So whoever is the other candidate is somebody who probably induces some feelings of anger in you, right? Because you are seeing certain things, traits, characteristics, words they say, whatever, and you are interpreting them as something negative. But you're going beyond that. What the Dalai Lama is saying there is you are superimposing a level of negativity on that person that is not all there. We are painting that person to be completely negative. And the mind of anger is looking at them in that way and assuming that that is correct, making that assessment. It's not doing that through a thought process. We don't sit there and go, should I see them that way or shouldn't I? We just automatically put the lens on of covering them all with negativity. And we then are upset at that and angry at that and want to push that out of our experience and do whatever we can to, harm that person or maybe, make sure they don't end up in the presidency or whatever the case might be. Again, I'm not saying there aren't certain criteria that should be used to determine what is a good action, a bad action, all these various things. That's not the point of this. The point is, what is your mind doing when you look at somebody who you are opposed to or who you find repulsive or whatever, and you paint them entirely that way? Buddhism says that we are exaggerating all the time when these destructive emotions arise. Let's do it with regard to something attractive, because this kind of desirous attachment is also one of these afflictive emotions. So say whatever your favorite music is, right? You will all have some, maybe you like a number of types of music, but what's kind of a favorite music that you would love to be listening to right now rather than listening to me? Just kidding. But so you can think about that, right? And that's your own particular view of that. And you think that there is nothing wrong with that music at all. Like how could anybody not like that music? Right? Because I think it's just the best. Well, not everybody likes that music, right? A lot of people who like music that we go, God, how can they listen to that? Right? But they're having a good old time listening to that music, right? They see that music the same way that we see our music, and it's all an exaggeration because there's nothing sort of there that makes my music great and that music bad, or their music great and my music bad. It's all a matter of our own thoughts. And the mind of attachment overlays all pleasantness on top of that object, whereas the mind of anger, hatred, overlays all unpleasantness in regard to that object. This is what Buddhism says about our psychology that's going on. And we are, again, I'm not saying this positive, this negative. These are both negative. When I take something that is pleasant and I exaggerate that pleasantness and grasp at it and want to keep experiencing it and think everybody who doesn't like it is, full of it. And then when I see over here all this horrible stuff and I think that's absolutely wrong and how can anybody support that or like that? Both of these are exaggerations. So how do we get rid of those exaggerations? Again, we have to see things more truly. We have to peel that all away and really see what is going on. See the invalidity, the lack of validness in regard to those negative emotions, and the valid qualities to what is positive. So he says, with this as a basis, we get angry at what prevents our desires. Hence, the foundation of a mind of hatred is not valid. However, a mind of love does have a valid foundation. Love is often said to be the antidote to hatred. So let's talk about this for a moment. So we've talked about how hatred doesn't have a valid foundation, just like that desire is attachment. Love is a genuine emotion that we cultivate in response to beings that we observe, and they can be even ourselves. We can have love towards ourselves. It's a simple wish for that being to have happiness, or those beings. Is there anything that we can see about that that is faulty or that is not valid? If we're observing ourselves or other beings who want happiness and we're wanting them to have that happiness, is there a fault in there? Is that a non-valid mind? Can anybody see any faults in it? It's pretty much seeing things as they are. Yes, Jandy.
When we do a dedication and it's so extreme, like anyone who is ill, may they no longer be ill. May, those
Oh, yeah.
exaggerations. But
Yeah.
so yeah,
So yeah, I agree. I mean, there are times when we dedicate or when we even have these thoughts of like some outrageous results to happen, like well, even in some of the higher Buddhist practices where you think of everybody being a Buddha and everybody being enlightened. Well, that's an exaggeration in the moment. But the thought of love in terms of love being the wish for beings to have happiness, everything from temporal happiness to ultimate happiness, is there any real flaw or fault in that? And again, it might get a little extreme at times. Sure, we might wish for happiness beyond what they have. But actually, when we wish for them to be enlightened even, which is something most beings don't have, we're still wishing for something they can attain. That's what His Holiness is kind of explaining here in this whole exploration of like, how do we actually rationalize that you can attain a state of enlightenment, that you can become a Buddha, because you can remove everything that is negative through a force that is positive, that has validity. Running out of time here for tonight. I thought I would get through a whole lot more. Let's keep moving forward. And if you do have another question, we'll have a little bit at the end. So when over a long period of time, an attitude that has a valid foundation competes with an attitude that does not, guess which one wins? The one with the valid foundation. This is like the two wolves, right? If we feed the wolf, and we got here a difference between the two wolves, in that the wolf that we're feeding is actually a valid wolf. It's actually something that we can say has some grounding in truth, because having a wish of love for other beings is perfectly in line with what they want and with what they can attain. They want them to be happy, and they can attain happiness. And the mind of hatred isn't valid in that way. The wolf we'd be feeding there, we're feeding something that's an exaggeration, that is not looking at things accurately. Therefore, His Holiness says, if you familiarize steadily over a long period of time with good attitudes that have a valid foundation, bad attitudes that do not will gradually diminish. You can see the dating of this teaching. I mean, in the translation, good and bad, I mean, essentially we mean the positive emotions and the negative emotions. Those that are not grounded in reality, the negative ones, will diminish as we continue to practice the positive ones. When training physically in broad jumping, for instance, the basis of the process is the gross physical body. Thus, there's a limit to how much you can jump. You can try, broad jumping, you probably won't be able to broad jump over the span of the Golden Gate Bridge, right? It's just not going to happen. There's a limit in terms of what the body can do. However, since the mind is an entity of what we call mere luminosity, clarity, and it has that function of knowing, again, it's not material. When the basis of training is the mind, it is possible through gradual familiarization to develop salutary states limitlessly. We can develop positive emotions to a limitless degree. Again, something that I think goes beyond the scientific Western psychology point of view. Go to see a therapist and you say, I want to be completely rid of all anger and never, ever have anger arise from me again, and I want to only be filled with loving kindness for all sentient beings. Therapist might go, well, I can help you a little bit, but I'm not sure I can get you all the way to that result. In Buddhism, we would say that is completely possible, and that is in part based on this fact that the basis of training is the mind. The mind doesn't have any limits. In fact, when you attain Buddhahood, it said that you have a mind that pervades everywhere. It's an omniscient mind that knows all things at all times and is aware of all beings, completely filled with compassion and wisdom. Pretty amazing. Qualities that depend on the mind can be increased limitlessly as much as you implement and increase the antidotal attitudes that counter afflictive emotions, so much do those unfavorable attitudes decrease, finally being extinguished altogether. Hence it is said that since we have a mind that has a nature of mere luminosity and knowing, all of us have the fundamental substances necessary for the attainment of Buddhahood. Again, these 2 nights aren't about attaining Buddhahood necessarily, but it shows the potential to which we could practice these positive states and what we could attain. This is from the Dhammapada, which is a set of sayings of the Buddha, which I think really reflects well on what we're dealing with here. Do not ignore the effect of each wise action, saying, this will come to nothing. Just as by the gradual fall of raindrops, the water jar is filled, so in time the wise become replete with good. So our minds will change to the degree to which we keep putting that drop of water in. We keep adding more and more positive thoughts and emotions. That is an antidote to the negative ones, and that is what the bucket of water will be filled with. So anyway, that's all I have time for tonight. We'll talk about the great efforts pretty quickly tomorrow night. And then with each of these emotions, I may not have tons of time to go through them, but I at least want to go through some of the main ones that we do work with in Buddhism that I think are really, quite important to have some focus. So any questions or comments from tonight? It's just 8:30 right now, so got time for a few. Does everything I said make some sense? Or is it, because again, I'll put that out there. Many of you have heard this before, but in Buddhist teachings, we're meant to investigate them to see the validity for ourselves. And if I've said anything tonight that you go, wow, that sounds way off, that's not true at all. Well, that's perfectly fine. It's up to you to investigate this and to see if what I'm saying and presenting is making sense, if it's logical and is something you can get behind. Yeah, Jandy, please.
Oh, I just was thinking of, in particular, about how you talked about compassion being an antidote or a positive, and I was thinking how self-compassion is so in the mainstream right now and how it really can help when we are feeling angry or upset, that we're understanding and gentle with ourselves and give some attention to that emotion, show some compassion if possible.
Absolutely.
And so, I was just thinking how that's kind of one of those kind of becoming more relevant and people are becoming more aware of it. I'm glad about that. It's helped me.
And it's the same sort of thing when we talk about, I think I mentioned earlier that the antithesis of compassion is cruelty, is, harmfulness, where we will actually even want to inflict harm on other beings rather than be concerned about their suffering. But we're doing that with ourselves, right? Self-compassion is the antidote to the way we beat ourselves up. Kristen Neff, who's done a lot of research on self-compassion, she says the way we talk to ourselves, if we talk to our friends that way, we wouldn't have any friends. They'd be like, what are you doing? I don't want to be with you, right? And we do that to ourselves quite easily. We will say things to ourselves that are just cruel. So it's the same thing we're trying to antidote. It's just that that's directed inwardly. And the compassion we often think of in regard to other beings is directed outwardly, but it's the same thing we're trying to address. So when we get into this on Wednesday night, that's really this pairing that we're going to see. With every one of these that is a positive state, it has an opposite state that it is an antidote to. And so every time we're cultivating that, whether we're addressing the actual negative state or not, it's going to be a force that makes that side weaker, weaker and weaker. We stop feeding that wolf and we keep feeding the other wolf, right? Any other comments or questions? I find this stuff fascinating, especially I find it fascinating that in Western science, they're finding similarities. It's not identical, but definitely more emphasis on positive emotions, which is great.
Yeah.
Yes, please, Mary Kay. Yes.
Have you studied the Navajo?
We were talking a little about the Navajo approach with you yesterday. Yeah.
Yes.
What did you want to share something from that tradition? I haven't, no.
Oh, that's I'll bring something next time.
Okay.
It's a way of calming, a way of I'm not good at expressing my feelings, but I will bring you the
Yes, please.
yeah, because they're really Asian. They're really Oriental.
Yeah, yeah.
The basic, you feel very much that you're in another country, another way of thinking.
This is the way of beauty, and that's the Navajo tradition as well, right? In beauty I walk, and this whole
Yes. Uh-huh.
yeah. Because I mean, we use beauty in our culture in a very weird way, but I think they mean something much deeper by the way of beauty than what we mean by beauty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rainbow and a way of looking at things, and
Uh-huh.
it's hope. But unfortunately, there's another religious group that's gone in and wiped. But underneath, there are still people there who have the old Navajo way of looking at life.
Wonderful. Yeah, if you can bring something in, that would be great to share. Because I think, again, Buddhism doesn't have a monopoly on this sort of stuff. I mean, we don't ever want to hold that view because the Buddha was just tuning into universal truths. And the universal truths are there for everyone to find, in any tradition to find. I'm always amazed. I grew up Catholic, and how much of what Christ taught is very similar to what the Buddha taught,
I haven't found that true, but okay.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, please.
Oh, I really liked that you talked about positive emotion broadens our viewpoint.
Uh-huh.
And maybe that's relates to the dedication we're doing. It broadens, right? When we think of all beings and wanting people to be happy and have well-being. And
I think that's one way to look at it. Thanks for sharing that, Jandy. Yeah. Anyway, I'll mention the one teaching I think that's really quite powerful that Christ gave was to love your enemy. I always talk to my Christian friends. I do a lot of interfaith work, and I'm like, what advice do you give to people about how to practice that? Because I'm curious. I never got it when I was growing up Catholic. Love your enemy. I mean, no one sat me down and said, oh, this is how you do that. I mean, in Buddhism, we have a tool for loving our enemy. And I think Christ meant that, to see your enemy through a different set of eyes and so on. And so I think there's some power in a lot of what Christ taught. Maybe not everything, but anyway. But it's always nice to see other traditions and to see the resonance of some of these ideas. So we should probably conclude tonight, but unless there was one more comment or question online, anyone? Okay, so over the next 2 days, just think about what we talked about, if you can. Just maybe spend a few minutes contemplating it and seeing if what I said makes sense, and if this is something you feel, is applicable in your life. And then again, when we meet on Wednesday, we'll talk more about some of these that we can actually practice, and I'll be giving some advice about how to do these. So it's not like, oh, just this one, this one, this one, and good luck with that. It'll be actually some ways to work with these. So, all right, let's just have a few moments of dedication. What Jandy was speaking to, if you're not familiar with this, is a way that we close the time that we've had together. We began it, the beginning was motivation, thinking why we are here. Now we dedicate, making sure that the energy we've created through our time together isn't wasted, but rather brings about the best possible result. So once more, we touched with that idea of us being here to cultivate our own skills around a deeper form of happiness, a state of optimal well-being. And we dedicate first for that so that each of us may attain that, but also that we can be a force in the world to help others to accomplish that and to bring all sentient beings to the happiness that they can experience. It actually is their right to experience. And we can also dedicate for the Dalai Lama and all these other amazing teachers who are guiding us on our path to help us in this process of awakening. Even spiritual leaders from other traditions who are also dedicated to helping sentient beings to find deeper forms of happiness. And we can also dedicate very quickly for the swift return of our spiritual guide, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and also dedicate for all the beings that you're holding in your hearts. Every one of us knows beings who are going through difficulties, challenges. We can send this positive energy out to them, and through our imagination, think that it becomes the cause to alleviate their suffering in this moment and to help them to find the peace that they seek. And may this be so for all beings through what we've done here together tonight. Okay. Have a good couple days, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you, everyone online. Thank you, Urs. Thank you, Stephen. Bay. Everyone else, Casey. Okay. All right. Very welcome, Kenan.